Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute. Hello, and welcome to episode 263 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. Did you know that imagination once played a key role in the ways that Americans understood and practiced medicine? I know, it sounds quite unscientific, but it's true. Americans once used imaginative means to better understand health, disease, and the ways that the human body works. Sari Altschuler is an assistant professor of English at Northeastern University, and she's the author of The Medical Imagination, Literature and Health in the Early United States. And today, Sari joins us to investigate the ways that early American doctors used imagination in their practice and learning of medicine. So, as we explore how early American doctors used their imaginations, Sari reveals how and why early American doctors used imagination in their practice of medicine, early American ideas about disease, health, and the body, and why we should consider medical imagination when we think about the histories of medicine and science. But first, did you know that Ben Franklin's World has a swag shop? You asked me a while ago for a way that you could purchase Ben Franklin's World t-shirts, mugs, and tote bags. So my Omohundro Institute colleague, Martha Howard, created an online store at benfranklinsworld.com/shop. Now, I have to say, since Martha created that store, you have sent me some really awesome pictures of you with your swag. For example, Jen sent me this great picture of how she uses her Ben Franklin's World mug at work. Matt sent me pictures of how he likes to wear his Ben Franklin's World t-shirt on the beaches of Hawaii. And Sarah showed me a picture of her Ben Franklin's World tote bag at work, carrying books home from her local library. Thank you so much for your support. Not only are you helping to spread the word about Ben Franklin's World and helping us to expand our audience, but your purchase of Ben Franklin's World swag from benfranklinsworld.com/shop really helps support the production of this show. So really, thank you. And please keep sending me those pictures. Okay, are you ready to see how early American doctors used just a bit of imagination to better understand and practice medicine? Let's go meet our guest historian. Joining us is an assistant professor of English, the associate director of the Humanities Center, and the founding director of the Health, Humanities, and Society minor at Northeastern University. Her research interests focus on American literature and culture before 1865, and she's written several journal articles and a book, The Medical Imagination, Literature and Health in the Early United States. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Sari Altschuler.
Thank you so much. It's just a pleasure to be here.
So, Sari, I wonder if we could begin our conversation with the title of your book, because it's a really interesting title, The Medical Imagination. So, where did you get the idea for your title, and what was the medical imagination?
Absolutely. So the title refers to the ways in which doctors and writers crafted, tested, and implemented medical theory using their imaginations. And partly I was interested in this title because I think it's something that contemporary doctors are really interested in. They are really invested in ideas of creativity as being linked to discovery, in ideas about innovation. But I think that there's less specificity now about how exactly to cultivate an imagination, how imagination gets used. And we have sort of an idea of it as linked to kind of vague ideas of genius. So I wanted to use that title as a kind of provocation to think about the ways in which actually in the late 18th and early 19th century, doctors and writers had a really much more elaborated sense of how the imagination worked and was really useful in medicine. And so the book focuses specifically on the role that imagination and literary forms in particular played in this work of kind of crafting, testing, and implementing medical theory. And I've called that a kind of practice of imaginative experimentation. So again, I think contemporary doctors are actually really interested in ideas of creativity and innovation. Those are not words that would have been used in the period. Imagination would have been the word. But in the past, doctors had a much greater sense of the ways in which imagination played a role in medical knowledge. And the way I like to think of that is there was more of a kind of complex of knowing. So imagination works with and alongside things like medical philosophy and empirical experimentation. I think today we think of imagination as feeling pretty unscientific, if not a kind of dangerous thing. You go into a doctor's office and the doctor says, "Oh, I'm just going to imagine a solution." I think that actually would be a pretty terrifying thing to hear as a patient. But there was a much more robust sense of the really specific and rigorous work that imagination did, especially in the late 18th and early 19th century. I'm excited about the ways in which we can use that to think about new roles for the imagination in medicine today.
Is it possible for us to see the medical imagination at work? Is there an example you could share of an early American doctor who had a really imaginative idea and that the end result of that idea was a real furthering of medical work and medical knowledge?
One of my favorite examples from the book is that Edgar Allan Poe, who's not a physician, but who was friends with a number of physician poets. And I want to just say, there were so many physicians who wrote poetry and published poetry in the late 18th and early 19th century. We don't necessarily think of those as things that go together, but going back to ancient Greece, Apollo is actually the god of both medicine and poetry. So it's a long history of this kind of work. So Edgar Allan Poe writes this short story, The Fall of the House of Usher. Many of you may know about it. And in it, in some ways, what he's doing is actually theorizing, and this seems a little outlandish to us today, he's theorizing the role that fungus plays in being a sort of cause of disease. So that seems, kind of silly and outlandish to us, but it gets taken up by his friend, John Kearsley Mitchell, who is also a physician poet, and he writes this whole treatise on the fungal origins of fevers. What's really interesting to me about that is that all this is happening in the 1830s and 1840s. The idea of fungus causing fevers, and here the fevers that people are specifically interested in are yellow fever and cholera, specifically cholera, which was causing a global pandemic at the time. And there's actually an international debate about who's actually discovered that cholera is caused by fungus. So cholera isn't caused by fungus, but they didn't know about bacteria. So the fungal origin of fever, in thinking about a kind of origin for cholera that is waterbound, that has to do with really small cellular organisms that get transmitted through water, Poe and John Kearsley Mitchell actually theorize an origin that comes much closer to the truth about how cholera is transmitted than anything that anyone else had theorized up until that point. And it takes decades for people to isolate the actual vector of transmission for cholera. But it's really interesting to me that the closest that people come before that comes through this kind of storytelling that both Poe and Mitchell engage in. I should say that when Mitchell then takes Poe's idea and turns it into medical writing, he does so in a Gothic way. So he talks about fungus as being this unnatural thing that spreads in the night that no one can see, and it looks kind of like blood and it terrorizes people. So he's using a lot of the same forms that Poe is using to kind of think about fungus as a means for thinking about the causes and the transmission of cholera.
So it sounds like early American doctors turned to literature and poetry because literature and poetry could be really useful tools for thinking through and sussing out ideas about disease and medicine.
Yeah, they actually used it in a lot of ways. And I think that's one of the most exciting things for me about the project. So we tend to think about things like imagination and literature as being, either the opposite of empirical medicine or thinking about it as just being a kind of way of describing the experiences, but not actually contributing to medical knowledge. But in the book, I'm really thinking about imagination and literature as doing a lot of work that medicine at the time couldn't do through empirical means. So, for example, poetry is a way of getting at medical questions at scales that you couldn't sort of experiment with otherwise. So thinking about how does health work on a global scale? How does health work on a microscopic scale? Or thinking about ethical questions. So they're kind of thought experiments that people are doing to begin to answer questions that you can't answer about the body. What's going on inside the healthy body? That's actually not a question that even today we can answer, because the second that you take a scalpel to a body, you make it unhealthy. So even when we have these kind of technologies like different kinds of imaging, X-rays, MRIs, those are still kind of representations of what's going on inside the healthy body. You still can't see inside. So people are using literature as a way to get inside and think about those kinds of questions. Other things that literature did, for example, it allowed people to try to imagine what it was like to be inside a body that was very different from your own. So when we think about race science, this is a way in which some doctors, for example, Robert Montgomery Burt, imagines himself inside the body of an African American slave and thinks about kind of how that body feels, how it experiences pain. I mean, there is a variety of other uses. So I hope I'm giving a sense of the variety of ways in which doctors turn to literature and imagination to think about health questions. The last thing I actually wanted to say is that, to me, one of the most exciting details that I found in my research was founding father and really the most famous physician for 100 years, Benjamin Rush. He told his students not only that imagination was the most important faculty of the mind, and so they should be really attentive to it, but that the process of medical judgment was actually exactly like the process of writing poetry. So when you put words next to one another and see how they fit together, and these are his words, exactly the same as the process of medical judgment. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why you see so many physician poets.
Do we know when early American doctors started to use literature and poetry to perform medical work? And was this a tradition that developed in North America, or was this a tradition that came to the early United States from elsewhere around the globe?
That's a great question. So certainly there are traditions, Atlantic traditions, that these physicians are drawing from. Erasmus Darwin quite famously thinks about poetry as a way of transmitting scientific knowledge. And, one idea that's coming over from Europe is that the imagination itself can be a cause for health or disease. So when we think about something like yellow fever, one of the theories that's circulating is actually that the thing that determines whether you get sick or not can be your imagination. You can be frightened, and they're going back to ancient Greece for this kind of thing. By hearing stories or going to a play, you can be frightened into a state of disease. That said, in the book, one of the things I'm really interested in is the ways in which, what I'm calling epistemic crises, so these moments where available forms of knowledge are insufficient to answer really pressing questions. So people are dying all around you of a contagious disease like yellow fever or cholera. And the books that you have and the professors that you went to, the solutions that they have are insufficient. This is a moment where actually I'm not saying that that's the only moment where people are using literature and imagination, but that is a moment where people are being more imaginative, trying things out, and using what seemed to us like pretty unconventional forms, but that actually were pretty widespread, using literature to try to think around problems that they didn't have answers to. So what happens when thousands of people are dying of yellow fever in Philadelphia? Well, if you don't have an answer to that, things that you might try are to try to think about the problem a little bit more imaginatively, and that's what people do.
So it sounds like a lot of early American doctors may have gained a lot of their medical knowledge, or at least they were able to experiment with new ideas and try to make sense of the medical quandaries they were facing through literature. Now, were there any other methods that early American doctors could have turned to at that time to perhaps acquire new medical knowledge or new medical skill sets?
So the three principal ways that people are acquiring medical knowledge are, if you have enough money, you go to Europe and you train in a place like Edinburgh. And that is how Benjamin Rush was trained. You might read about it in books, especially sort of moving into a couple of decades into the 19th century. You get the proliferation of domestic medicine guides. But really, the way that a lot of physicians were trained in the period is through apprenticeships. That said, the thing that I'm really interested in the book is, again, the ways in which people are looking to literary examples. So again, Benjamin Rush at one point talks about how Shakespeare is the place where you go if you want to find out, for example, about madness. Shakespeare's done a better job of describing this than any physician has. And I think, to me, that's just a really cool moment of thinking about what it is that literature is doing. It's not just window dressing. These little excerpts of poems and things that are all over the medical literature are not just decorative, they're actually fundamental to the way that people are learning.
It seems that literature could get quite graphic. You talked about the doctor who was writing medical literature in the Gothic style. So I wonder, what does this literature have to say or reveal about how early Americans conceptualized the body?
Yeah. So part of the project in the book is thinking about the ways in which, I think now we think like, oh, there's medicine and there's politics. And of course, medicine is somewhat political, but they're not so intrinsically linked. That wasn't true, especially in the early national period. So one of the things about this period that really marks it off is that these physicians they're medical philosophers. There's a move toward experimentation later, but they're really thinking about the body as a system. And because these folks are religious, the way that they're thinking about that system is as a perfect system that's ordained by God. So, especially in the late 18th century, physicians are arguing over what the one thing is that actually dominates the health of the body. Is it excitement? Is it some sense of balance? What is the kind of key to unlocking health? And that model, one of the things I think that is a little harder for us to wrap our minds around in the contemporary moment is that that model also was a model for the state. So because God has these sort of perfect models, and because the body is actually a part of the state, the health of specific bodies then served as models for the healthy state. So in this period, one of the things that is kind of interesting intellectually is that these doctors had been learning from Europe that these perfect models are modeled on the monarchy. So, for example, William Harvey, who was fundamental to really discovering some things about how the circulatory system worked, in the preface to his book about the circulatory system, he writes to Charles I, I'm offering this to you because the heart is just like the king. Or, for example, other models would say, actually, the brain is just like the king and it rules over the rest of the body. Suddenly, after the revolution, models can't really work that way because there's a problem, especially for a founding father like Benjamin Rush, with thinking about how the body is like a monarchy. Well, then that would be actually really antithetical to thinking about republicanism as an ideal model. So Rush has a problem. He needs to think about how to have a kind of republican model of health. And so I think it's actually just one of the neatest things about his medical philosophy is that he says, you know what? The circulatory system is actually the most important system in the body, but it's the blood vessels. It's not the heart that's the most important. So the blood vessels are this kind of republican force. And then the heart, which had been the king for William Harvey, suddenly becomes, he calls it an ocean to which all the blood kind of returns and passes through. But all of the work that you want to do then as a physician, it doesn't have to be heart surgery. You want to bleed people. And so that's the reason why Rush really advocates bleeding, because he thinks that really everything having to do with the health of the body comes down to whether or not what's happening in your blood vessels is healthy.
Speaking of the actual practice of medicine, how did early American doctors translate all the different ideas that they were reading about and working out in literature? How did they translate all these different ideas into their practice of everyday medicine?
That's a good question. So the work that I did focused somewhat on that, but one thing that I was really interested in was thinking about the ways in which people were kind of reading and learning about medicine. So in terms of Rush, he advocates just kind of bleeding everyone. And so you get this kind of cartoonish figure of early American medicine where everybody's just bleeding people all the time. But there were other kinds of practices that people picked up from reading about medical practice. And that had to do in part, here, my interest has been mostly in the kinds of literary forms and how they worked. And so one way in which literary forms were being used to think about medical practice was that people's emotions and imagination, again, were really integral to thinking about how to keep the body healthy. So you would warn people away from doing things by using satire. You would make fun of particular practices, and that's how you would keep people healthy. Or, for example, in terms of the Gothic, that was another strategy for thinking about health, was to make people, not just to make people afraid of them, but to kind of narratively inoculate them against particular kinds of danger. So if you could be frightened into a state of sickness, then you want people to be exposed. This is what Charles Brockden Brown does with yellow fever. You want people to be exposed to stories about health that they know are fictional.
We have been talking a lot about the reading and learning of medicine, and Charlene wonders about the how. How did early American physicians disseminate information? Did early American doctors just share medical information through the literature we've been discussing, or did publications like medical journals or some sort of scientific newspaper exist and circulate during the early Republic?
Absolutely. That's a great question. And certainly the dissemination of medical knowledge takes a variety of forms. So you have somebody, again, I'm using the example of Benjamin Rush because he's such a towering figure for about 100 years of American medicine. And his idea is that he's going to disseminate medical knowledge through basically every form of communication he can get access to. So that includes letters that he writes to people, and then he collects some of those letters in books. And also he lectures quite widely. He's really responsible for training a whole generation of American doctors, and they're naming their sons after him. But, one of the things that to me is kind of interesting is that for Rush, that really required, and I think this speaks to a kind of Republican sense of things, that really required he wanted control over how that information was circulating. So he's really the author of the lectures. Even when he's bringing in other people's voices, he's kind of controlling how they come in. Other people had more democratic visions. For example, Elihu Hubbard Smith and Samuel Latham Mitchell are two of the editors of the Medical Repository, which is the first American medical journal out of New York. And their idea is that if you just bring together enough good information and circulate it out to people, that's really how you keep the nation healthy, is through just getting people access to good information. And sometimes there will be information that's not so good. But if you have a kind of glut of information, I think this is in some ways actually similar to the kind of fantasy about the internet in its early days, although I don't think we necessarily feel this way anymore. If people have enough access to information, then truth and good health will sort of flow from that. But, I have to say that in some ways, that's why I'm interested in this project as a literary critic or a literary historian, because all of those are forms of writing and they make certain kinds of things possible. And this is sort of how I think about how the sort of power of forms of writing, or what I would think of as a kind of literary form, they make certain kinds of things possible, and it's possible to say certain kinds of things, and it's not possible to say other kinds of things. So fundamentally, and this is one of my favorite stories about, these differences in circulation of medical writing, the editors of the Medical Repository go to Benjamin Rush. They're trained by him. They love his work. They ask him to support the Medical Repository, this first journal of American medicine, and he refuses. And they're kind of crushed by this. They couldn't imagine that he would want to refuse this form that's going to circulate good information throughout the New Republic, but he wants top-down control. And I think, one of the cool things about these stories is that it actually shows how people have different ideas about what good circulation would be. So Elihu Hubbard Smith, who thinks that just circulating good information is going to be great, he is roommates with Charles Brockden Brown, who is this Gothic novelist. And Brockden Brown watches Elihu Hubbard Smith, this editor of the Medical Repository. He watches him die in front of him. And Smith and Brown had this great relationship. They shared their writing. Smith, who is a physician, he edits novels of Charles Brockden Brown. Brown is sort of reading and interacting and helping him with the Medical Repository. So Brown, in some ways, sees the failures of Smith's democratic ideas about the circulation of medical knowledge. And he writes these dark novels that are trying to grapple with the failures of Smith's really utopian system, and thinking instead about how do people deal with dark information? How do they deal with bad rumors that might make them sick?
Benjamin Rush is someone who keeps popping up and coming up in our conversation. And I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about Rush, who he was, and what made him such a thought leader in early American medicine.
Yeah. So the first thing to say is that I think today we have this fantasy that doctors have an area of expertise that's really separate from the rest of culture and politics and society. That's not true in the late 18th century. So Rush is a political figure. He's a signer of the Declaration of Independence. He is treasurer of the U.S. Mint. He founds Dickinson College. He's a leader in education. And I think the first thing that I want to say is he's really this kind of Renaissance man. And it's, I think, useful to think about that as part of why he's so successful as a medical philosopher. And he really was more of a medical philosopher, what we might call a rationalist instead of an empiricist. He's really interested in these kind of perfect forms that are indicative of a kind of divine plan for things. So part of what makes him so successful is that he's so networked, and he really is involved in all these projects that he doesn't think of as separate from one another, but actually as kind of collaborating with one another. So when he's thinking about the health of the body, he's also thinking about the health of the state. He's thinking about the role that education plays in helping to make the bodies and minds of Americans healthy. And so I think a lot of the power of his writing for early Americans is that he is able to speak in so many registers, and he writes satire and he writes Gothic text and he writes in sentimental modes, and he's thinking about the health of the body and he's thinking about the health of the mind. And to us, I think like that's an impossible amount of diversity in terms of his projects. But for him, they're all part of the same project. And one of the things that I think makes his influence so long lasting, it lasts, for like 100 years. He is really the most famous person in American medicine. I think part of the reason for that has not only to do with the kind of strength of this unitary idea about the world and about health that he promotes, but also that after he dies, American medicine goes through this period of like a real proliferation of ways of knowing and uncertainty. And people think of it as a real, like a nadir of American medicine. Like, oh, this is a moment where people are disaffected with doctors. They're looking for alternative practices. I would say you can see even within those alternative practices, people are still looking back to Benjamin Rush. So I think that there's a real power to this Republican vision of health that he puts forward that really isn't contested fully until the rise of empirical medicine in the second half of the 19th century. I mean, it's rising throughout from 1820 onward for a variety of reasons, but the way in which medical professionalization narrows what we think of as medicine in the late 19th and early 20th century, that's the real moment when Benjamin Rush ceases to be this kind of dominant voice. And that's an amazing legacy.
So was Rush the first thought leader of American medicine, or were there other people who would have vied for this position?
Yeah, he certainly did have rivals. I've also been interested. I think that the project that he's invested in of thinking about a kind of Republican model for health is one that a lot of people are interested in at the time. So, for example, Samuel Latham Mitchell, this doctor that I mentioned, who's one of the editors of the Medical Repository, he's trying to think about health at a totally different scale. So he's thinking, and this is something that, again, he's in dialogue with people from Europe, but he's putting a particularly US spin on his work. He's thinking about health as all coming down to a kind of molecular level. So he has this idea about this compound called septin, which is actually nitrous oxide. And he thinks that all disease, everything bad that happens to the body comes down to septin. And septin is in contrast to oxygen. And there had been a debate about the discovery of oxygen. Oxygen is this really exciting compound that's been isolated in Europe. And all of this is an intensely political discussion. So some people are thinking about oxygen and they're thinking about it in a monarchical model. Others are thinking about it in this kind of radically democratic model. Ultimately, what Samuel Latham Mitchell does, and this is a project that's really similar to Rush's, is he tries to think about it in a Republican model. And one of the ways that he does this is through this poem that he writes called The Doctrine of Septin, where he's thinking about the ways in which septin and oxygen are competing for health on this kind of epic scale. But, oxygen itself can't just be responsible for health more broadly. There need to be sort of these checks and balances in place in order to make sure that the balances between septin and oxygen are controlled in ways that promote the health of not only the nation, but actually the globe. So that's one example. There's also Elihu Hubbard Smith, who I mentioned. He's thinking about health at an environmental level, ways in which you could kind of keep the environment of the new United States healthy enough to make all of the bodies within it also healthy. And so he writes this utopian fantasy in which he's thinking about how the dissemination of medical information and the kind of political and social and actually architectural structures of the US and educational structures might all go toward a kind of Republican fantasy for health. So all of that's to say, yes, Rush is a great figure, but he's involved in a project that lots of other people are also involved in. He just has a bigger bullhorn in some ways.
The Republican model or project of health has also come up several times in our conversation. So could you tell us a bit more about the Republican model or Republican project of health?
What makes it different is that it doesn't have a single figurehead. The body is not conceived of as being controlled from the top down in the way that a monarchy would be. So when Rush is thinking about the circulatory system and the blood vessels as actually being responsible for the health of the body, that would be a purely democratic model. But actually, he's then thinking about the nerves as a kind of check on the blood vessels. So there really is, for Rush, for Mitchell, for Smith, there really is a sense that the sort of ideal health of the body is modeled on the ideal health of the state. Medicine is then like an intensely political project because you need healthy bodies in order to have a healthy state. For people like Rush, political upheaval was actually a catalyst for disease. So he thinks about things, he has these diseases called revolutiona anarchia that are about the kind of dangers of political upheaval at the level of the body itself. So, you want to think of those things not in literary terms, we would call this a metonym, which is to say that the body is a part of the state, rather than thinking of this as a kind of, it's not a metaphor, which would say, oh, the body's analogous to the state. It is analogous. It's actually, though, much more tightly connected. And that's why it's so important to think about, if you think that a republic is the ideal model for a state, it's then also really important to think about the ways in which that's true also at a corporeal level.
Do we still do this today, where we associate and create models of medicine and health that really align with systems of government and the state?
I would say we do, but I think it's less explicit. So I think we think a little bit more in terms of metaphor, but we can't get away from the fact that the paradigms, the structures of thinking that we bring to the world are things that we use in a variety of different registers and a variety of different topics. So I think we think of those as different. I mean, one of the things that I found both most charming and in some ways least true is that, you go to the March for Science and people have signs up that say, science is not political. But they're at a march for science that is explicitly about politics. So, and I get that what's happening there is that the sign is supposed to say like, oh, I shouldn't have to be here because science is objective. I mean, science is somewhat objective, but we need to think about the ways in which we approach the world are so shaped by the paradigms that we bring to it. So we can't escape the fact that the language that we use is shaped by the structures that we know and the structures that we believe in. So you get, for example, in the 20th century, you get metaphors of cancer being like these cells that are turning on the body itself, just like it's a kind of Cold War mentality, right? Like you have your own cells are then turned by this sort of devious force within the body. And we continue to have those kinds of metaphors that dominate the way we can't help it. And that's what I want to say. I don't mean this as a critique of medicine and science. I mean this to say this is just actually is a structure of medicine and science. We can't get around the ways that we think about the world, and we bring them to bear on topics of medicine and science as well. And it would be better if we recognize them, because once we recognize that you can't escape the fact that you bring particular perspectives to every topic that you look at, then I think you can be a little clearer about what the stakes are of the ways of knowing that you do bring.
So we've talked a lot about white men and the different ways that they theorized medicine and imagined the body and how it all worked. And we've even talked about their literary pursuits, where they thought through all these different ideas about medicine and worked to disseminate their ideas. But Monica wonders if there was any room for early American women to play a role in shaping ideas and coming up with ideas about early American medicine.
That's a great question. I mean, I think partly there was, and you have moments, I mean, I've been particularly interested in the kind of literary moments where women who are writing alternative forms of medicine. So you get Benjamin Rush's niece in 1812 writing this novel in which she actively lampoons her uncle's ideas about medicine. The novel's called Kelroy, and she writes this character of this buffoon. I mean, it's a wonderful novel. It's kind of like Jane Austen-ish, and she's theorizing the ways in which networks of women keep Philadelphia healthy, as opposed to these men that seem like they can't actually do very much. And later you have inheritances of that kind of thing. So Harriet Beecher Stowe writes this novel, Dread, in which she draws from theories of health that were circulating in the African American community. Cholera, which is this global pandemic that was just devastating. I mean, I think we still don't have a cure for it, but we can treat cholera. It's just, for those of you who may not know the symptoms, basically you vomit and defecate to death. And it is very sudden and very devastating. And it killed millions of people around the globe in the early 1830s. In the African American community, cholera was theorized as actually retribution for the sins of slavery. So it's connected quite directly to the fallout of Nat Turner's rebellion. And Stowe, rather than turning to white medicine to think about how to theorize cholera, she actually has a figure of a white doctor in it and says basically that he was like way too interested and curious, and instead is drawing on these theories of cholera as retribution for slavery when she writes about cholera as the scourge that basically just comes and kills all of benevolent white people. And Martin Delany, who's an African-American writer and a political figure, but also began to be trained as a doctor, is kicked out of Harvard Medical School because his peers don't want him there. He writes a novel in response to Stowe that also is kind of taking seriously the idea of contagious disease, the ways that cholera kind of moves as retribution for participation in the slave trade.
And this brings us to another important question, which is, what about African and Indigenous ideas about medicine? Kyle is curious to know whether Anglo and Anglo-American practitioners of medicine ever took seriously the medical ideas of African and Indigenous peoples. And if they did take these ideas seriously, did they incorporate these ideas into their medical imagination?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a number of people have kind of written about the real debt that early American medicine owed to African and Indigenous practices and forms of knowledge that's fundamental to the early stories of inoculation in Boston. And certainly for centuries, people have thought about kind of Indigenous healing as a way of thinking about legitimizing American medicine. One thing that I think is neat from a kind of contemporary perspective is that when we think about that kind of historical inheritance of medicine, we actually often denigrate it. We say like, oh, people didn't know what they were doing in the past. The same is true of the ways in which African American and Indigenous knowledge get, written out of American medical knowledge. However, one of my former colleagues, Cassandra Quave, from when I was on faculty at Emory, she's doing this amazing work looking back at old uses of medicine and thinking about historical texts in which different kinds of botanical knowledge, including Indigenous knowledge, are practiced. And I mean, of course, this is rife with potential danger in terms of thinking about which kinds of knowledge people wanted to be used and disseminated and which kinds of knowledge Indigenous communities did not want stolen from them. But one thing that I think is interesting about her work is looking back at the past for thinking about possible solutions to things like antibiotic resistance. And I think, one of the lessons here is thinking about how we often tend to say, like, people in the past didn't know anything about medicine. We're only interested in it from this, like, purely, either a fascination, a curiosity, or we're interested in talking about how little they knew or how we came to know as much as we do today. But I think it's neat to sort of, A, take these forms of knowledge on their own terms, and B, think about what they still have to offer us.
So, Sari, why do you think we should think about and consider the role of medical imagination when we think about and consider the histories of medicine and science?
First of all, because it was so integral to the way that people in the 18th century and early 19th century were thinking about the way that medical knowledge worked. So you get, even up through the early 20th century, these kind of laments about the loss of imagination in medicine. It really is with the kind of codification and the real shift in medical training that happens in the early 20th century that people begin to think about imagination as not part of medical knowledge. And it might be worth us thinking that the last 100 years, since there's a famous report called the Flexner Report, which is one of the things that really shifted medical training to being purely scientific, only about biology, chemistry, physics, etc. And I think it would be worth us thinking that perhaps that kind of narrow specialization that's happened in the last 100 years is the anomaly, rather than thinking about this long history of medical imagination as being somehow weird or anomalous. And I'm interested in it for a variety of reasons. And so I'm answering in some ways more now about the contemporary context. There are all these movements toward including more disciplines in the study of medicine and the study of health. The MCAT recently added a section on sociology and psychology. And I think it should also have a section on the humanities. I think doctors would be trained better and the health professions would be better off if they also had a toolkit that included historical knowledge, that included ideas about creative analytical thinking. And that's really what I think the humanities can offer. And I think that there's a legacy of that in this history of the medical imagination. So the answer is sort of twofold. One, the imagination had this huge role in determining and helping to kind of craft, test, and implement, as I was saying before, medical theory at the time. It worked with empirical knowledge. I think we often think about those things as antithetical today, but they weren't. But I also think that in a contemporary sense, we ought to see how short the time period has been that we haven't considered imagination to be part of the way that we understand and practice medicine, and what we might stand to gain by taking really seriously these practices from the past for thinking about how we might think differently about medical practice in the future. And the space to do that, as I argue in the book, is in these medical humanities courses that are popping up everywhere, health humanities courses. They're very popular. And part of the reason why I think they're popular is that there's a sense in medicine that we actually need to think differently about the way that medical knowledge is produced. But I don't think that those courses, they often have to do more with physician feeling and preventing physician burnout and how do you empathize with your patients. But as humanists, we know that the humanities do a lot more than that.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about the fact that the humanities may not be included in medical education, but we have all these medical doctors that are trained to treat humans. And of course, humanities subjects work to help us better understand humans and their societies and cultures.
Exactly. And I think, so historians of medicine have long made this case in some senses, right? That in order to study medicine, you really need to know about its history for all kinds of reasons, including ethical breaches. But medicine also is not the same as science. I think there's been a real push to make medicine into science. But if the fundamental encounter in medicine is between sort of two people, in a clinical setting, working together on a particular problem that is about something that's fundamentally human, I think the humanities have a lot of tools for speaking to how we might make more of those connections, whether it's philosophy offering a kind of ethical perspective, history offering a sort of historicized way of thinking about those encounters and thinking about how they came to be and how they're shaped, or literature in terms of thinking about what are the stories that we tell about health and how do they shape the way that we understand what's happening when we talk to one another, or how do our stories about contagious disease, for example, promote stigma among certain populations. Certainly a great example of that is the AIDS epidemic, where we have particular narratives about how things are spread. And I think what would be so useful is not to think about the humanities as some kind of touchy-feely, and I argue this a bit in the book, not to think about the humanities as some kind of touchy-feely thing that just gives you a sense of what other human beings are like, but actually gives you a set of tools to do medicine better. And for the health professions more generally, to think more capaciously about how we might do good in the world through different health practices.
Now it's time for the time warp. This is the fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently, or if someone had acted differently. In your opinion, what might have been different about the development of early Americans' medical imagination if women had been allowed to fully participate in the professional medical community?
I love that question because I think that one of the things as I was reading and writing the book, I got really frustrated. Most of the ways in which women appear in the book have to do more with the kind of literary side and thinking about literature as an avenue through which women could participate. I mean, my first sort of gut reaction to that question is to say we would know more about pregnancy and we would know more about early childhood and forms that have to do with maternity than we do today. We know much less about women's health issues, really fundamental things like pregnancy, in part because I think medicine was so dominated, especially this kind of professionalized or pre-professional medicine that happened in and around universities. Because women weren't part of that space, it was so dominated by this idea of the white male body as the body. And so a lot of the theorizing and then later a lot of the kind of research and experimentation that happened and that continues to happen has to do with the white male body as the ideal and bodies like women's bodies as a kind of secondary or like a less perfect version of the body. One thing that I think is really fascinating as an example of this is that Robert Montgomery Bird, who is a physician and a novelist and a medical professor, he writes this really crazy, zany novel in the 1830s called Shepherd Lee, in which his imaginative experimentation is that he imagines himself into the bodies of 6 different types of Americans. And so you get a Southerner and you get a Quaker, and you even get an African-American slave and a Jew, but there are no women. He never thinks like, what would it be like to be inside a woman's body? And I have to say, there were far fewer Jews in 1830s Philadelphia or 1830s United States than there were women. And so the fact that he's not even asking the question really demonstrates the kind of failure of imagination on the part of white men, and failure, I think, in part because women are not part of this conversation. And this coincides with the real sidelining of midwives and other kinds of expertise that women brought to health. So as obstetrics is becoming really a male practice and midwives are really being sidelined, simultaneously, you get this real sense that the white male body is the body that needs to be studied. And I think, again, today, we know so much less about things like pregnancy and childbirth than we would if women had been asking those questions. They seem to me like such fundamental questions. And once you start looking into the research, you see how unsettled and uncertain it is around any variety of basic questions like, what should women do when they're pregnant? What's safe? How do you have the healthiest pregnancy, healthiest delivery? These kinds of questions, medical knowledge is coming up with new answers to them every 5 years. And part of the reason why a lot of the medicine is actually less settled than it should be, I think, has to do with the fact that women historically have not been included in the ways that they should have been.
So, Sari, where are your historical interests taking you next? Do you have a new research project that you're working on?
So if this project was really about ways of knowing the body, the different ways that people in the late 18th and early 19th centuries knew the body, my new project is about the ways in which different kinds of bodies help us know the world differently. So I'm interested in disability, and I'm mostly interested in the ways in which the kinds of communities of people for particular kinds of impairments that grew up in the late 18th and early 19th century, so schools for the blind, schools for the deaf, create new forms of knowledge that actually then affect the way that American culture develops in ways that we don't think about. So I'm really interested, for example, in how schools for the blind, or schools for visually impaired individuals, they were called schools for the blind, give us a new sense of, like, for example, cultures of reading. How do you know and think about reading differently if you have technologies like raised print, sort of along a similar way of thinking? If you're deaf, then how does the kind of naturalness of oratory, how is that challenged by the presence of a new deaf community, especially in the early 19th century? And so I'm interested in the ways in which these communities put pressure on dominant narratives about, the founding of the nation. In particular, I'm interested in how the accounts of people with these impairments can help us develop a richer sense of early US culture.
Now, what if we have questions about the medical imagination and about how early Americans were writing and thinking about medicine in early America? Is there a way that we can reach out to you and ask our questions?
I'm easy to reach. You can just look me up on the internet. I have a website, and also you can feel free to email me. If you just Google me at Northeastern, you should easily be able to find my email address.
Sari Altschuler, thank you for joining us and for helping us better understand the early American medical imagination and the different roles it played in early American medicine.
Thank you so much for having me.
In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Americans really believed that to understand medicine, you had to have and use imagination. In fact, the foremost physician in early America, Benjamin Rush, emphasized this point to his students by telling them that they should read and write more poetry. Now, as Sari noted, the relationship between literature and medicine may seem really odd to us today because we tend to think of medicine as more closely related to science than to the humanities. But in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, many early American doctors turned to literature and poetry to really think through their questions and ideas about health, disease, and the body. Of course, the use of literature to think through medical ideas wasn't an early American invention. It was an ancient practice. The ancient Greeks saw many linkages between medicine and literature, and they enshrined the connections that they saw between the two in their celebration of the god Apollo. Apollo was the god of knowledge, healing, and disease, and also the god of music and poetry. Okay, so just how beneficial or useful was the practice of using literature to think through medical ideas? As Sari related, it proved to be quite useful and quite beneficial in early America. At a time when early Americans were trying to explain and understand how and why yellow fever and cholera epidemics kept happening, literature helped them make sense of what seemed nonsensical to them on the ground. It's actually quite remarkable when you think about just how close some of these physicians came to the truth about how the body functioned and how disease spread when they took the time to imagine it all. Even Benjamin Rush pointed out this fact to his students when he advised them to read the works of Shakespeare to better understand conditions of madness. What Rush and other early American doctors realized was that our imaginations really do allow us to think and empathize in ways that we can't do with scientific data alone. So, for early Americans, medicine wasn't science as much as it was a humanist practice. And this is why Sari said she conducted her research and wrote her book. She'd like us to see that even when it comes to medicine and science, the past has something to teach us about practices that once worked well and practices that might work well for us again. Look for more information about Sari, her book, The Medical Imagination, plus notes and links for everything we talked about today on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/263. Please remember that I love to see pictures of you and your Ben Franklin's World swag. And if you don't have a t-shirt, mug, tote bag, or hoodie with the Ben Franklin's World logo on it, visit our online store, benfranklinsworld.com/shop. Production assistance for this podcast comes from the Omohundro Institute's Digital Projects team. Joseph Edelman, Martha Howard, Kayla Pittman, Holly White, and Karen Wolf. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. Finally, what do you think about Sari's idea that we should think about medicine as a humanistic practice? Do you think we might be able to make more medical advances and improve our healthcare system if more doctors studied history, literature, and philosophy? I'm curious what you think, so please send me your thoughts. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.